social ethics in Leviticus, but what we need to first understand is God's presence demonstrated in tabernacle as the basis for Israel's ethics. That it is because God is present in, with, among the people, mostly with and among the people, that Israel is then given a certain prescription, a command on a way to live. And so we have, again, what Sinai, the wilderness, has these overtones of God being present with the people, which again calls back to Eden. And that God's presence with the people is at least partly fulfilled in tabernacle, if not fulfilled in tabernacle. Because again, as we talked about with the Abrahamic covenant, that it's the 3 P's: people, place, and presence. And at this point, they don't have a place, but God is present with the people. So we got 2 out of 3, almost there. And so the tabernacle has God's presence, that the glory that's shown to Moses, again, this demonstration of God's presence with Israel. This demonstration of God's presence with Israel. And a lot of the regulations given for sacrificial system focuses on maintaining the presence of God among them. And so again, as you're reading through Leviticus, if you read through at a different time, and what seems like really dry, boring reading, again, is part of the way that the relationship between God and Israel is maintained. Part of the relationship between God and Israel that is maintained. And so I'm not going to spend too much time here because this has more to do with worship, but there's a couple things that I do want for us to pay attention to. One, that the ruler or the king does not lead worship. That worship is, if you want to call it, led by the community, led by a group of people, with Yahweh as the ruler or leader of the people. And that the journey signifies a kind of sacred procession. Journey signifies a kind of sacred procession, as the people are moving again from Egypt into the promised land, with God leading the people. And again, this is really important for us, especially as you take Kings and Prophets, and you're talking about Joshua and Judges, as the people are moving into the land and have settled in the land. That it's God leading the people through the wilderness. And it's because of that there's certain demands that are placed upon the people and understanding. And so, anybody want to read this? Leviticus 25.
Yeah, for sure.
Good, man.
All right. Leviticus 25, Jubilee. You shall count off 7 weeks a year, 7 times a year, so that the period of 7 weeks of years gives 49 years. Then you shall have the trumpet sounded loud. On the 10th day of the 7th month, on the Day of Atonement, you shall have the trumpet sounded throughout all your land. You shall hallow the 50th year, and you shall proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. You shall return every one of you to your property, and every one of you to your family. That 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. You shall not sow or reap the aftergrowth or harvest the unpruned vines. For it is a jubilee, it shall be holy to you. You shall eat only what the field itself produces. In this year of jubilee, you shall return every one of you to your property. When you make a sale to your neighbor or buy from your neighbor, you shall not cheat one another. You shall observe my statutes and faithfully keep my ordinances, so that you may live on the land securely.
You want to take the second half too?
If any of your kin fall into difficulty and become dependent on you, you shall support them. They shall live with you as though resident aliens. Do not take interest in advance or otherwise make a profit from them, but fear your God. Let them live with you. You shall not lend them money at interest taken in advance or provide them food at a profit. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan to be your God. If any who are dependent on you become so impoverished that they sell themselves to you, you shall not make them serve as slaves. They shall remain with you as hired or bound laborers. They shall serve with you until the year of Jubilee. Then they and their children with them shall be free from your authority. They shall go back to their own family and return to their ancestral property. For they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves are sold. You shall not rule over them with harshness, but shall fear your God.
Great. Thank you so much, Elijah. So there's a few things going on here that we do need to confront, especially with Jubilee and the way, and you guys worked on this in you guys' reading and for you guys' assignment. There was a question that was a little bit redundant that Elijah, you had brought up on your email. So if you went ahead and skipped that one, that'd be fine. That we see the concern for specific economically disadvantaged people, specifically with the poor and those that do not have land. And we'll go ahead and discuss some of this because of some of the ways that the way Leviticus and the Hebrew describes some of this. So you have here, if your kin fall into difficulty and dependent on you, you shall support them. They shall live with you as resident aliens. Do not take interest. If any who are dependent on you become so impoverished that they sell themselves to you. So in Hebrew, this the phrase of where is it? If they become dependent on you or fall into difficulty. In Hebrew, that phrase means if your kin cannot hold themselves up, that literally if their hand becomes weak or if their hand becomes shaky. And so again, this inability to support oneself due to whatever, often economic or agricultural difficulties that causes poverty. And so debt, economic disparity forms the greatest internal threat to the social foundation for Israel. And fair to say that the same thing kind of happens today. And so with God as the owner of the land, gifts it or gives it to Israel as her inheritance for entering into covenant with him. Some of you had mentioned, or there's a kind of disparity in the reading because that for the Jubilee, you shall eat only what the field itself produces. You shall, in this year, shall return each one of you to your property. But the thing is that they are on a journey. So it's kind of presupposing the land of which they're on. So if that part kind of just didn't make sense, or it seemed a little funky, that how are they talking about land when they're still wandering around in the wilderness? That's why. It's because it's presupposing when Israel enters into the land. And that again, to go back to the text, what we have here is a link between they are my servants whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. And again, where is it at? Okay, well, it wasn't on this slide, it was on a different one. That you have the Exodus event that reveals Yahweh's merciful character. And again, I brought this up before, and I'll bring it up again, that the Exodus event will help shape Israel's imagination, both in terms of how they understand God and how they understand themselves. And this is where the understanding of self as a group comes into play. Because of the fact that they understand because Yahweh is this way, we ought to be this way. Because Yahweh has been compassionate, we ought to be compassionate. Because Yahweh was merciful, we ought to be merciful. And how this happens is in treatment to others, especially those that are economically less fortunate. And so while this is a kind of constant throughout the years, even if it's not Jubilee with the people, when they have land, they don't go all the way to the ends, but leave the edges for the poor. That what the intention here is that there is a kind of economic relief for those who have fallen into economic hardship. And the link between Jubilee and Day of Atonement brings together the concept of worship and justice. Worship and justice comes together in Jubilee. And so the fact that we don't ever really see Jubilee enacted quite possibly relays the reality that either Israel's failure to understand the relationship between their worship and justice, and again, just the reality that wherever there's idolatry, injustice is soon to follow. And that even for us in our context and in our day, that we're worshiping rightly when we're becoming a more just, a more faithful people, to respond how Jesus would respond and to act how Jesus would act. Now we've done worship rightly, if I can say that, when we've become a more just people. Let me get my student loan debt canceled in 7 years. I'm hoping 7 months. Yeah, every time I always read through passages like this and we talk about this, it's like, yeah, the freedom. I'll be dancing in the street like David. We get that student loan debt forgiven. Getting undignified. Anyway. So the land, that's another issue that is at stake here. Again, for an agrarian migrant people, the land is of much importance, both in terms of livestock and then to live off the land and for the land to produce. And the same is still true. The same is still true today, that there is very much concerns about land, with indigenous people being run off of lands, with certain lands being taken over historically, whether it be through colonialism or interventions by various nations across the world. That there is certain interest within the land economically, but what Yahweh commends for his people is that the land may not be bought or sold, but rather it's leased for a period of time until the next Jubilee. Why? Because the land belongs to Yahweh. It doesn't belong to any individual. And that in fearing God, that one places far greater value on personal relationship than on personal gain. That again, what is more important is the sustainability and the maintaining of communal relationships rather than just purely making a few bucks. People are more important than property. And it wouldn't be unfair to say that what we're running up against and what we've been running up against historically is the exact opposite. And this is still an issue today. Still an issue today. Again, everything from sex trafficking and child slavery to labor, child labor. And these people, again, as they're traveling, are called Greem or resident aliens or Tishbaim, tenants, renters with God, the God's landlord. The God's landlord. And again, this is why it had us consider patriarchy. That God being responsible as the patriarch in the household is the one who that brings these families under his protection, under his care. So when God provides a land for his people, when Yahweh provides a land for his people, it's not just a God providing a land for his worshipers, but rather a father providing land for his family, a patriarch providing a land for his tribe or his clan. There was something else I want to bring up, but it slips my mind now. But yeah, I'll go ahead and I'll bring it up near the end. Slaves and debtors. So as I had read through in Leviticus 25, that you have a person who's Makah or become poor, Mika has become poor and has fallen so far into debt that they have to sell their patrimony, again, their inheritance, in order to survive. And by doing this, you're essentially putting yourself in not only in a desperate place, but also a very dangerous place. So what you would have is that the kind of first line of defense is kind of nearest kinsman, a family member that would come to their assistance. And you have somebody like this, when you're reading through the story of Ruth, this is how Boaz functions. That Boaz keeps covenant faithfulness, which is why he's taken as such a kind of hero character in the story, is the way that Boaz responds to Ruth, despite her being the outsider. And so here again, what is being provided in terms of economic relief is help through the community. It's not just put on the outside or any specific system as much as it is one that's kind of a familial safety net that is provided for the people through relationship. And so again, that if a slave or debtor slave has not been redeemed by the ways provided for them to get freedom, they go out, they're freed through Jubilee. That it's not a perpetual kind of slavery, nor is the poverty meant to be a perpetual state, but rather, again, through family members or through this kind of relief, through worship, through obedience, that they're then freed from their debts. So in order to talk about, to kind of drive home some of these things, there's a few things that I want for us to kind of wrap our heads around, is that a group identity, the relationship with others constituted by relational bonds, shared experiences, or intergroup arrangements. And so a lot of this you'll be familiar with your group of friends, your teammates, coworkers, family members, and even bigger than that, your community, whether it be in a location or ethnic community, the kind of bonds that are shared, again, shared relationships, shared experiences, relational bonds, a functional identity, that it's a status or role that defines one place in the societal structure. Again, myself, I'm both a son, I'm a grandson, I'm also a professor, but how those function in relationships functions differently. That, again, as a professor, I speak a little bit differently, even though I keep a lot of my weird slang. But that the relationships are oriented differently, as whereas me being a grandson, it's again a different role in a certain structure. And a lot of you guys have the same thing, that you guys are sons and daughters, you guys are nieces and nephews, some of y'all are aunties and uncles. And that with that, again, and you guys are co-workers. Some of you guys might be shift supervisors or shift leads, or leaders in different ways. That it just, again, that kind of function changes your orientation to those around you, including those within the group identity. And then lastly, you have the destitute state, that the reduced state of existence characterized by limited resources or complete dependence on others for sustenance and well-being. And so how do these three interact, and why do I bring them up in Leviticus? Well, you have an Israelite, again, part of the group of Israel, part of the people of God, who sells themselves, who's fallen into a state of destitution, to a fellow Israelite, again, another one of the group, is to be treated as a hired servant function rather than the slave that they have become, their status. So this reorganizing of relationship that happens because of an identity that follows that they are family before they are coworkers or have another kind of orientation towards one another that is purely economic. That what precedes the economic relationship is the familial relationship that they share as being a part of God's people. And I would dare to say that that there can be transformational impact if we were to understand this as a church. That we don't do economics the way everybody else does economics, but that rather what is of primary importance is the way in which we relate to one another. And it's out of that, of belonging to God's family, belonging to God's people, being a part of God's kingdom, that reorients and reorganizes not only our priorities, but the ways in which we do business. That again, we switch around this kind of function and status, that despite people, again, from being employees to being something more dignified, that to seek the dignity of others and to encourage the flourishing of our communities, whether it be through job training, job skills, through the things that can be provided through economic relief and economic efforts. Again, it's something that Yahweh is wanting to restore, especially amongst the most economically disadvantaged. Which, fun fact, includes the Levites, the priests, which is why they're up eating up all the sacrifices. And why tithes are even given. Because again, tithes are given because the Levites, they've got no land. Their one job is to maintain the temple. So even them, they're dependent upon the community as well. But this concern for the treatment of destitute persons, again, it's based on their belonging to God's people, this group identity, and only secondarily on their functional status within the community. That what's of primary importance, they're belonging to God's people. And then there's secondary considerations on their being servants. The group Israel is defined by God's redemptive act on behalf of its provision for its future status and functional identity. That again, that the group is shaped by Yahweh's redemptive act in and through Exodus. And so if you kind of, again, so much of this has New Testament implications that you can tease out with our experience of baptism, experiences of communion, that become, again, the common experience that we all share of being buried into Christ's death and being raised back to life. That brings us into God's family and that identifies us as a part of God's people. And because of that, we're oriented differently towards one another. Or at least ought to be oriented differently towards one another. But in losing that identity, of losing the identity of Yahweh having done this redemptive act on our behalf, means the widening of boundaries between those who are inside, those who are outside, those who are rich and those who are poor, and those who have and those who do not have, even within God's own family. When you lose this redemptive act, you lose the kind of knitting of community that is Yahweh's intention. And again, that's going to happen in Israel, especially when you get to the prophets. There's a passage in Isaiah, I don't think it's 63. It might be somewhere around 54, 55, where Isaiah chastises those who have built for themselves giant houses, have bought up a bunch of land. Meanwhile, the poor have no land and have nowhere to go. And so this kind of injustice that Isaiah charges the people with, or specifically charges the rich with, is something that is of concern because, again, there's that widening of boundaries, which is tied to this loss of identity, of forgetting that Yahweh, who's been compassionate to us, doesn't require me to be compassionate towards others. And that by losing that memory, forgetting what Yahweh's done, doesn't alleviate us from the responsibility, but helps us to think so, which is dangerous territory, especially for the Israelites. And so memory will play an important part, and we'll talk about them when we get to Deuteronomy. And so motivations. The part of the intention is that you have the story of the Exodus and these challenges of the community that then provide the motivation for their ethics. That the God of Exodus, who comes into contact with poverty, debt, economic disparity, institutes this act of release, this jubilee. And that God's redemption of the Israelites out of Egypt is definitive in defining the identity and the way that Israelites ought to treat one another and treat outsiders. And that's a really important part, especially in this context, because there's usual hostility towards outsiders, but what Yahweh's intention is for a kind of differentness amongst the people, uniqueness, a kind of holiness amongst the people that reflects Yahweh. Because again, to remember how Yahweh was compassionate even as Israel was enslaved. On these last couple things, and then if there's any questions, we'll talk about it. And that you are my servants suggests that being a servant of God precludes being a servant to a human being. That again, being a servant of Yahweh precludes any kind of servitude to any human being. Being a part of God's people precludes any kind of belonging to anything else. On that the formative identity that God's people have are ones as being God's people, first and foremost. And that Yahweh is concerned about the poor and provides a community solution to poverty. That it's through the community's response and the community's care that poverty may not be ended, but is at least alleviated in part. That there is a response to the issues that often ail Israel. And it'll be because of their disobedience to this that poverty is perpetuated. And so, are there any thoughts, questions, comments, concerns?
It's just cool seeing, like, I feel like there's a lot of parallels here between this and Acts 2.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I just find it cool there's that parallel there.
Yeah. What parallels do you see?
Sorry, you might be hearing noise in the background,
That's
but
okay.
no, just like nothing like super specific, but I guess just as we were going about it, like I thought of, like, oh, like how this is very adamant about very basically saying, like, meeting everybody's needs, and having debts forgiven, and those that are incapable of providing for themselves, like, supported and provided for by God. It's like what it says in Acts 2, that they shared all things in common, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that and
What
I
else they
can't
do? What else they do?
Rick, you put me on the spot.
I did. They
Dang.
they sold
I
what they
didn't.
had
Yes, yeah. Thank you.
and
Appreciate
gave
that.
it away to any as had need.
Yeah, yes, that's right. And they broke bread and ate
Yep. They
every
ate
day.
together, spent time together, going over the teachings.
That's kind of irrelevant, but
Yeah. You're good, man.
I just wanted to fulfill the challenge.
Yeah, there you go. Hey, good enough for me. But yeah, there's huge correlations there between what we see as these early Christians are participating. Maybe they don't pronounce a formal jubilee, but they do seemingly they understand and live out this kind of vision of one not being bound to certain kind of protocols or procedures that say, like, oh, we have to do it this way. We have to have certain things adjusted this way or certain financial things in place. The other one is the other generosity that they have towards one another that is, I don't want to say offensive to our modern sensibilities, but for us, it seems like a long way off that you would take Jesus so seriously. I was thinking about it the other day, that is there anything more difficult, especially for us modern Americans, than to take Jesus seriously and to not discount Jesus's point about sell all you have and give it to the poor. But that's exactly what these early Christians do. And maybe they didn't have a lot, but there was some that did have a lot. Because their meeting in homes happened usually in large colonnades by Christians that were well off. And Theophilus was one of them in Luke's gospel. So there is this kind of living out, like you said, Elijah, this radical kind of generosity that places the love for people over love for property. And I don't know, it's one of those things that maybe, I mean, I know 3,000 were added after Pentecost, but I just wonder if there's something to that kind of generosity, not just for the good of the church, but for the good of those in need. Specifically, I want to be specific. The good of those in need, and that's how they were able to. That's how the church grew, and how they were adding so many people day by day, or daily, by kind of radical generosity. And so I know, talking to a lot of students that were taking out loans just to make ends meet for school, and we're economics is a weird thing to talk about because there's not a lot of money in our pockets. Um, but again, it has everything to do with the postures of our hearts. Um, the kind of generosity that we show with a little will eventually roll over in itself to show generosity when we have a lot. If when we have a lot. And then again, it's being generous in all things. It's not just money. It's also in our love, our care, our attention, our words, our kindness. Um, that I get a little, and this is because I mostly because I was on the inside. So most of you know, I was an associate pastor for five years, and then I was a youth pastor before that, and a youth leader before that. So I've been in the game for a little bit, but it's understandable when people get a little paranoid when it's the person up front of the church start talking about generosity and specifically related to tithe, but not much anything else. Especially when generosity is so much bigger than what we just do with money. But it's a lot about the ways in which we don't seek to hoard for ourselves, especially in a world that says there's not enough for everybody. You got to get yours. Whether it be, again, everything from economics to justice to jobs to clothing to praise, admiration, attention, that the kind of false narrative that there's not enough for everybody, so you better get yours. And again, being able to entrust ourselves that God's generous and that he cares for us. And that's the narrative controlling our lives, is that if God was so generous to hand over his son, how much more so will we be so generous to give us what we need day by day? And as a Latino, Latin American male that struggles every day to make sure me and my wife, family is taken care of, that's an everyday struggle. And I'm sure the same is true for a lot of you. And caring about your families, your friends, making sure everybody's taken care of. Just that I know for myself specifically, I grew up with that kind of pressure and responsibility from my grandpa. Gotta work, gotta work, gotta work. There's nothing wrong with that. It's true that work is a good thing. There's also kind of paranoia that was instilled that's still being unworked. Works. Yep. And so it's interesting what could happen if we choose to kind of redefine. I know some of you are in church, some of you not, of what we can do if we were to put together a collaborative efforts. That 10% pastors asking for, what it would look like if we put that towards economic relief. The single mom that needs some tires for her car, for grandma, grandpa that don't have insurance, that we're able to help pay off some bills for them. I don't know, start up a coffee shop, start up a business in through the church to be able to provide jobs for people, job training to help people get out of whether it be gangs or situations at home, and be able to provide again through the initiative of the church. Why? Because of God's kingdom being here, that things can be different. That kind of hopeful resistance that we can do something here and now, because God's spirit is with us and is powering us towards that, to see the kingdom of God, to see heaven and earth meet. get a little bit of the foretaste of this other kingdom of God that's coming. All right. Any other thoughts, questions, comments? All right. Well, you guys have an absolutely awesome Thursday. Office hours today too. It'll be a little bit shortened today because I have a meeting. So it'll be 2 to 3. Um, come through. Some of you guys are sending me those the stimmy memes. Keep them coming. Love them. I know they're still out there. Got one of a big thing of pastor, the meat thing. So keep them coming. Love them. If not, don't get a chance to see you guys. Have an absolutely wonderful spring break. Take a nap. Don't let too many days go by before you're like, oh shoot, it's already Sunday night. Haven't done anything. So, all right.